Hello and welcome to the first part of this demonstration on the topic of file and folder automation. In this video, you'll discover how to use file and folder activities in UiPath Studio to perform key tasks like selecting and creating files and folders, as well as extracting the contents of an archive. Use key VB.NET methods to work with files and folders. Now, what's the use case? We begin with a zipped file that holds information about multiple clients, with each client having a folder of their own. Inside each client's folder, there are a number of documents, the contract and some invoices, all in PDF format. The aim of the automation that we're building is to look for the contracts of each company, rename them with the company name, and then store them in a dedicated separate folder. For this first part of the demo, the goal is to have the proper folder architecture to fulfill our final task. Let's start. In the System category of the Activities panel, you'll find the File subsection, where all of the activities specific to file and folder automation reside. Let's explore them for a bit. At a first glance, we can observe that there are activities that work with files, with a file's contents, or with folders or archives. Additionally, there are those that manage working with files and folders. For example, ones that check their existence, or that iterate through them. Let's take a closer look at the activities. Append line helps with adding lines to existing text files. Browse for file and browse for folder retrieve the path to a file or folder in string format after an automation user selects a target file or folder during runtime. Then compress zip files and extract unzip files, help with archiving and respectively unarchiving files. Here we can also see activities that copy, create and delete files and folders. Note that for deleting, we can choose to act on a file, a folder, or a file and folder object. For the latter, we use the delete action. With file change trigger, we can monitor file changes. For instance, creation, renaming, updating, and so on. File exists and folder exists, check for the existence of a file or folder. Whereas the for each activities, iterate through the files in a folder, or the folders in a folder. The get file info and get folder info retrieve information about file or folder objects such as size, name, and others. We can also change the location of a file or a folder with the move activities. Path exists validates the existence of a given path. Reading and writing text files is also possible with the read text file and the write text file activities. The rename activities change the name of a file or folder. And finally, the wait for download activity will help monitor the download process of a given file. You might notice some parallelism between the activities, as most of them mirror each other, working specifically with files or folders, but similarly. And now, let's start our workflow development, shall we? First, we'll provide some context by renaming the main sequence and adding an annotation to it. Great! To enable the automation user to select the zip file that they want to automate during runtime, we'll add a browse for file action. We'll then store the selected file path in the input file path string variable. Notice that we have the possibility to filter the files shown based on the file type. Here, it's not necessary. You might wonder why we recommend using the browse for file activity in this case, instead of providing the folder path to the zip file right now. We have more than one reason for it. First, the folder in need of automation might change over time. Secondly, the automation that we're building now will likely be used by other people with different machines, which also means different folder paths. It basically comes down to the reusability of this automation. Now here's a reflection prompt for you. Can you think of other reasons or situations where browse for file is more adequate to use than a folder path provided at design time? And before we go on, we'll rename the activity to provide more clarity on its purpose. A very important aspect to note is that Browse for File only collects the file's path. Further in this automation, we'll need other pieces of information about the file. We can retrieve those with the Get File Info activity. The same thing applies to the corresponding activities dedicated to working with folders. Moreover, Get File Info will retrieve the info in the form of a file object. We'll provide the previously created variable as the file path, then create a new one for the output, input file info. What exact information will this new variable hold? It'll be the file size, name, full path, parent folder, and other data about modification, access, and creation dates, and whether the file is in read-only mode or not. Now it's time to create two new folders, one which will hold the extracted files, and one dedicated to the contracts with each client company. For that, we start with a multiple assign activity. We then decide on what parent folder both of the folders we'll create should have. Let's name it Input Folder Path. For its value, we can go ahead and use the same directory as the input files. We need this value as a string and not an object, so we'll use the directory name. Let's see what we did up until now in action. Let's set a breakpoint on the multiple assign activity and debug our automation. Here's the selection window where we can choose the zip file from. Let's use the immediate panel to find out more about the available data for a few variables and statements. We can check what the input file info directory name returns, the parent folder of the file that we selected earlier. Next, let's check the name of the file from the information stored in the input file info variable. As such, we'll use the input file info object, calling it name. The returned result includes the .zip extension as well, and the extension can be shown on its own too. But to retrieve the name without the extension, we must write an expression that generates a substring. We start with the first character, 0, and we end with the length of the input file name, from which we subtract the extension. So how do we write that? Input file info dot name dot length minus input file info dot extension dot length. The result? As expected, the file name without the extension, client documents. We'll copy the expression as we'll use it for the extracted folder path. And now we can stop debugging and remove the breakpoint. Let's create a new variable for the extracted folder path. And then, as file directory to the input folder path, we add the copied expression from earlier. Now this path is complete. The next step is to create the path for the contracts folder. When defining it, we start as before, but to the input folder path, we can manually add a straightforward name, contracts, and done. Now we can go back and rename some activities, describing their purposes better. After that, let's add an extract unzip files activity. Rename it, then annotate it. With the context in place, we provide the path to the file to be extracted, input file path, and the destination, extracted folder path. If we check the extract to dedicated folder option, another folder in the same location with the same name as the zip file will be generated automatically. In our case, we don't need it checked as we already have a path for the extracted folder. But we'll do it in the demo just to show you how the end result will appear. Now with this in mind, why have we taken all of these steps then? Think in terms of reusability. Let's say that we wanted the destination folder to reside in another location. we can create that path with the same steps that we took before, but with some minor tweaks. If we went with the default dedicated folder, that wouldn't have been possible. Thus, this approach gives us more freedom when it comes to choosing the destination of the extracted documents. And you've probably guessed it, it's time to give this workflow a run. If we open the project pane and refresh it, we can see here the Client Documents folder inside the parent folder of the zip file. And in it, there are all of the client documents extracted. Notice how a subfolder with the name Client Documents has been created inside the Client Documents folder. This is because we both generated a new path for the unarchived files and had the dedicated folder option ticked in the Extract Unzip Files activity. As this was a test run before the final step, we'll delete this folder. In the next run, it'll get created again. Good, now we can create the Contracts folder. For this, we'll use the Create Folder activity and provide the path to the Contracts folder that we generated earlier. And now we're ready for the final run. Like before, in the project panel, after a refresh, we'll see the newly generated folders, the one with the extracted documents and the one for the contracts, both within the same parent directory as the input file. If we open the Documents folder, we can view the folders in the File Explorer. The Client Documents folder holds all of the extracted files. Whereas the Contracts folder hasn't been populated yet. One last detail to prepare for the next part of this demo, renaming the Create File action. And we're good. Now before we part, let's recap the main steps that we took to build the automation up until this point. With the Browse for File activity, we enabled the users of this automation to select the file that they wish to automate. This is highly important in case the path of this file varies from run to run and ups the reusability of this automation. As the Browse for File activity retrieves only the file path and we needed more than that to continue the workflow development, we added a Get File Info activity and created a variable which holds more information about the file than just the path, name, size, parent folder, and more. Further, we used this information to create folder paths for the parent folder, the extracted folder, and the contracts folder. To link them with their values, we used a multiple assign activity. For the extracted folder, we used an expression to name it identically to the input file, only without the .zip extension. For the contracts folder, we added the name manually. Next, we used an Extract or Unzip Files activity to extract the files from the zipped file to the one that we created. And then we generated the Contracts folder. Congrats, you've completed the first part of this demonstration of file and folder automation. In the next video, you'll discover how you can add the contracts to their dedicated folder, rename them, and you'll make use of a file and folder iteration. See you soon, and happy automation!